let me start with my UBI journey. Actually, it began here. 2 years ago, David kindly organized a conference at which I was speaking on the subject of transition to a more sustainable and harmonious world. And in that presentation, I had quite a chunk dedicated to UBI. At the same time, I was already compiling material to my book, which was recently published, on who could save humanity from superintelligence. Is it European Union, NATO, or China? And you may wonder, what does it have to do with UBI? I devoted 2 chapters to UBI in that book. One on the negative aspect of AI on UBI, and the other one on the positive aspects, how UBI can actually help us get most of artificial intelligence. So this is essentially going to be the core of my presentation today. But before I go further on, I would like to perhaps discuss the deeper rationale for considering AI and UBI. Think about this. We no longer live in the world that changes at a linear pace. It started to change at exponential rate, almost. I don't think about just technology. I'll give some examples that show that it goes outside technology. The second aspect of the changed reality is something that is not yet widely discussed, but worries me tremendously. You probably have all heard about Ray Kurzweil predictions, probably the most famous futurist you can get, who said that by 2029 we shall have the artificial intelligent agent that will surpass human ingenuity, invention, will be cleverer than most of us, but only in some domains. That's why IBM Watson division, has pledged not to do any AGI. They have compartmentalized, say we only do the divisional AI in order to make sure that something out of control doesn't happen. Actually, I think this is a false presumption. I think by around the date that Ray Kurzweil mentioned, around 2030, we shall have, or we may have, an immature artificial intelligence that can be extremely dangerous. It will be very crude. It will surpass our intellect in some divisions, but because of the self-learning and perhaps the ability to reset its goals, it may dissipate in other domains. And why I mention this in this context is that by 2030, we will have to put in place a foolproof control system over AI. Nick Bostrom devoted a whole book to that question in titled Superintelligence. And in my book, I've also spent some time in saying why the control of AI is so important. Therefore, by 2030, essentially about a decade, in that decade, I think we as humanity have to put enormous impact and attention to controlling AI. This is a much more dangerous aspect of civilization progress than, for instance, nuclear war. Perhaps pandemics could be on the same level. And therefore, when I'm thinking about UBI, I immediately think about values. And I come to that subject in the next slide when I'm talking about 3 major tasks regarding the global approach to AI. So we must maintain the full control over the goals of immature superintelligence. How can we do that? I don't want to go into the full list of Nick Bostrom's control mechanism of superintelligence. I would like to concentrate on just one aspect. It's the universal human values. That we need to develop a system of values or ethics that we as humanity aspire to, and that we could instill those values into the superintelligence like, if you like a controlling chip. The good news is that, paradoxically, something is happening here in London. Apart from the Asilomar 23 principles, which talk a lot about ethics and values, actually 6 of those principles relate to the universal values of humanity, as I call it. Here in London, there is an all-party parliamentary group devoted to artificial intelligence, believe it or not. Not only that, they have committed to organize a worldwide global convention on AI, where the question of ethics may play a prominent role. So it's not that bad. We may somehow get it right by 2030. But we should also think about even a longer period. The preparation should start now. The danger is not yet there, but we should essentially prime ourselves as human beings to the time where we'll have to coexist with superintelligence. That may mean morphing humans gradually into transhumans, ensuring that purely biological humans, us, have the right and freedom to stay in our biological body, that we won't be forced to be transhumans. And the third element, if we survive that generation, say 2040, 2045, which is probably going to be the most dangerous period in the history of humanity. And I just remind you that 99.5% of species disappeared from the planet. And about the Fermi's paradox, right, why there aren't any civilizations around. Because once they've reached the level of technological competence, they just destroy themselves. So we are not immune from that. But assuming that we go over that generation, we may start living in the world of utter abundance. And I really am an optimist. Now, the third element is the one that most politicians love to talk about, because it's about the benefits that AI would provide, and which will also enable UBIA to be implemented, about which I'll be talking in a minute. So, the first impact of UBIA, and I'm now talking about the negative aspect, which I mentioned earlier, is the AI-induced technological unemployment. Economists who are present here probably know this subject very well, that since about the Second World War, the productivity curve has been rising steadily. But the employment curve, which was also rising, wasn't rising that fast. What is happening now is that that gap between the productivity and the level of employment is getting bigger. It is rising exponentially, and very soon it will reach the knee curve. That's where, in my view, technological unemployment will really start to be felt. And that's the time that we should prepare for right now. Now, some people here, there are some speakers that are very optimistic about the future, saying, there's no problem, there will be enough jobs, don't worry about AI. Thomas Frey, 2015, done his exercise on the potential jobs that might be lost by 2030. He went as far as saying that by that time, 2 billion people worldwide would be unemployed, almost 50%. And he listed 101 jobs which would disappear. I have compiled a table. At the top of the table, there are the new technologies, AI-driven technologies, and then the jobs that are lost. Most of these jobs are so-called low IQ jobs, but you will find also the high IQ jobs, like, for instance, lawyers, neurosurgeons, accountants, journalists, authors, and so on. The artificial intelligence and technological employment will affect all of us in some degree. But there are some people that will say there is no difference. We've been there before. Really? Think about this. The scale of what is going to happen in terms of technological employment will be uncomparable with, for instance, when we compare the introduction of electronic switchboards, because it will cover the entirety of our life. Spread. It will spread around like wildfire. Just to remind you, in 2007, when iPhone was invented, what happened? In less than 3 years' time, you could find it in the deepest of the African jungle. That's how fast technology spreads, and that's how fast the technological unemployment will spread. It wouldn't be affecting people to the same degree in every country, but everybody will be affected. Speed. We have heard about the Moore's law, but everybody knows about the cost of genomics, how the cost of decoding genome has been falling faster than the Moore's law. And there are other areas which have nothing to do directly with technology, indirectly, like, for instance, producing artificial meat from stem cells. Just to remind you, in 2015, one hamburger, the first hamburger that was produced in that way, cost $315,000. In 2 to 3 years' time, it will cost $11, 3 times more than it costs right now. But apparently, it is much tastier. The reason that you can buy it right now is not for technological reason, but for the legal system that the FDA has to approve it, and takes time. And obviously, there is a competition. But think about this for a while. If we have artificial meat on our shelves, and not just beef, but they produce ducks, chicken, and so on, what will be the impact of on Argentinian economy, on the Argentinian beef, Brazilian, and so on agriculture everywhere, where you only need 1% of space and around 1% of energy that is needed to produce naturally grown beef. It will be a tremendous impact. So there is no comparison with what we had before. Disruption of supply delivery chain. Amazon Go. How many shop assistants do you have there? Just one. He's a security guy. And this is just the beginning. And then again, Amazon. If you need any more examples, think about what happened last month. Just here in the UK. Marks and Spencer, Dixon, House of Fraser, and Debenhams. All 4 retail chains are in deep trouble because of Amazon. This is the company that started as a bookseller, and now they can sell, or even do, whatever you want, even in artificial intelligence itself. Think about Alexa. Now, should we be worried? Well, Americans are optimists. And here is one that is a super optimist. His name is Andrew Paul McAfee, and he is a co-director of MIT Initiative on Digital Economy. He says, the great American society will sort out problems of technologically oriented unemployment because it has always dealt nicely with a crisis. Really? I beg to differ. Because, in my view, this is not a technological or even economic problem. It is a social problem. It's a tremendously important social problem. And Americans haven't been tremendously good at sorting out social problems. Think about the health system, insurance, lobbying, gun control, voting system. I named just those. So I don't have too much trust in the judgment of the Americans that everything is going to be fine. We may have problems. The problem is related to work itself, not as a means to sustain ourselves, but as Voltaire over 200 years ago said, we need work because it saves us from 3 great evils: boredom, vice, and only then need. And I wholeheartedly agree with him. So, are there any solutions to minimize the negative impact of AI on the labor market? There are quite a few. If you think about cutting down the working hours, we are at the bottom end. Well, South Korea is better, of course, or worse, if you like. There are, at the moment, we work 1,620 hours a year. That means almost 300 hours longer than the Germans. By 2030, we could easily reduce it by a third and then be just below the current German level. What it means reducing by a third? That means that 1/3 more people can find work. So that is a kind of a buffer, still waiting to be used. Flexible retirement age, and I'm talking only about the UK right now. We are nowhere near to some continental countries where you have flexible retirement from the age of 50. You will get a smaller pension, but you can lead your life as you want, which is a value in itself. And then job sharing. And we shouldn't just think about job sharing with other humans. We have to seriously consider, actually this is already happening, in some Japanese hotels where you have humans and you have robots working together. We will have to do the job sharing to a much bigger extent than we do now. There are only about 37% of the corporations in Europe that use job sharing. Now, this is my pet project. I mentioned that at my previous presentation here. And I only mentioned it here, not just because it's my pet project. I just wanted to talk about the functionality behind that. This personal mentor that I've been trying to reinvent with UCL and one other AI company is a kind of personal assistant that you find now on Google or Alexa and so on. Think about 2 to 3 years' time, and my product probably won't reach the market, and I'm not concerned about it. I'm thinking about how much good it can deliver to people, especially people that don't know how to lead their lives. It can interview people over a number of months or years, knowing everything about their yearnings, their fears, their strengths, weaknesses, opportunities and threats, their skills, about their families, and so on. And they also, I'm thinking about the personal assistant, it will know everything about the external world. So it can provide, almost handhold people in realizing their life goals to their fullness, in their fullness. And also to secure the jobs that will give them maximum satisfaction. And I think it is really something that I put a lot of hope in, so that we will have things like that that will help us fairly inexpensively to come over the threshold of the rising technological unemployment. And then this is the subject of today's debate, universal basic income. And obviously, most people would like to queue up where no work, free stuff. But, as I said earlier, work is not just the means of sustaining ourselves. It makes us human. That gives us life purpose. And that's why I think that picture is a little bit misleading. The best example of it is when you go onto the internet and you can see how much free stuff there is and delivered by people free of charge because they just want to share their wealth with others. I don't see any reason that in the future it's not going to continue like that. People would like to help others, to volunteer, and so on. So now to the core of our subject on UBI. The artificial intelligence and UBI can have a cushioning effect against the ills of technological unemployment. But in order to have the right impact, in my view, it should start early as possible. And I think all the previous speakers express the same view. It should start small. Again, people express that idea. But in my view, it should continue being rolled out much faster than, for instance, inflation, so that at some stage it will reach the level where people could not sustain themselves totally, but to a degree. Like, for instance, if we start the basic income, that's the word, at 30% of the poverty line today, it will be around £5,000. And this is, I think, in the line where one of the speakers mentioned £50, so £100 a week, right? So you can't live for £5,000 a year. And this is my point. It should be only basic. I may disagree with some of the previous speakers around. It shouldn't be at the level that you may not have to work. It is something that gives people a cushion, just something from which you can start adding extra money, or if you work, then there's not a problem. So that's one point. The second one should be universal on an individual basis. I think we are in agreement here. Unconditional, again, and paid periodically and not as a lump sum. 2 years ago, I compiled a table on the basis of various UBI schemes proposed for the UK. As you can see, an average adult annual UBI would be around £4,200. In today's money, around £5,000. But what is more important is that the cost, the extra cost, irrespective of the scheme, would roughly be 3% of additional tax revenue. So that is affordable, because every chancellor during his budget speech gives more than that as a giveaway. If there is an election year, you can get even more than that. Now, here is to the major controversy with one of the speakers. I think Guy is already gone. Universal credit. I'm talking about the conditional UBI. Conditional UBI, because I see UBI not just as a means to an end. I see it in perspective of 20, 30 years as a road to somewhere that we all will live different lives than today. That work will essentially be a pleasure. People will want to work because they want to do something, not that they have to. But in order for all of the people, to some extent, to share in what they can do and what they can offer each other, this is the kind of a solidarity of those who, well, society is based on solidarity. So everybody should work and should provide something. And that conditional UBI should be there. Where I disagree with Guy is in the universal credit. Ian Duncan Smith, for me, is a political hero in one sense, that he introduced that. He was brave enough to do that. Not many people know that in 2011, he was very, very close to introduce the universal basic income. He didn't do that because he saw how complex the universal credit was on its own. I'm talking here about the principles. I'm not talking about the nitty-gritty, how it is being implemented. There are many, many teething problems. But the principle is absolutely right. What hasn't been mentioned here today until me now saying that is one word. It's the reciprocity. We have to be responsible for our lives. We all have to share. We cannot expect that the state will give us money for absolutely nothing. And that's why we should have basic income, which is ethical thing, a right, no question about that. But then we should have a conditional UBI where it will depend on how much we contribute. And the universal credit creates an ideal platform for launching such a conditional UBI right now. It will be paid periodically, and here I would add that the latest RSA proposal would fall into it. It could be paid as a lump sum. If, for instance, somebody wants to do a 3-year course or studies, right, he may be given £10,000 once every 10 years to do that. Nothing wrong with that. So the lump sum in conditional UBI would have its place. So it could be paid in cash or vouchers. For instance, you have a voucher and go to the university and you hand it over. The two conditions are already there. One is the job seekers allowance and the employment and support allowance. And further education, voluntary work, national level sport, all of this, and the list would go further on, could be the conditions attached to getting more than just the basic UBI. So how can UBI be paid in the age of AI? And here is the benevolence of AI, if you like. Economists agree that GDP, most of the economists in the organizations like OECD, World Forum, or International Monetary Fund, and so on, that GDP would rise around 2.5%. This is an example of a study done by Goldman Sachs that says something different, that GDP might be even 4%. And I think the error that the economists and most of the scientists still make, including people like the futurists, like Kurzweil, who admitted that we just can't grasp what an exponential change means. Exponential change will cause that GDP will also be affected, even including the economic crisis that may happen. So if this is the case, if we assume that GDP will be around 4% rather than 2.5%, we are getting around 1 to 1.5% of GDP extra, which we can dedicate to paying for UBI. Demonetization of the cost of living, that was mentioned already. Think about your smartphone. What you have in your smartphone would have been worth $1 million in 1980. Now think about the next 10 to 12 years. What kind of service you will have free of charge there? Like monitoring your health day by day free of charge, or even injecting medicine and so on. So that's the second element. And the third one, mentioned and criticized, and that's why I use the word smart tax on robots. I'm not talking about taxing robots directly, but if you think about 2030 or 2040, when people predict there will be 9 billion robots, more than the human beings, most of the employees in companies will be robots. So we have to charge robots, or the companies, much more than now in terms of taxes, because we will be taxing essentially robots indirectly. Now, my final slide relates to the roadmap for UBI implementation, how to make it happen. And I just bought the guy's book on universal basic income. I hope to learn even more than I know right now. But let me give you my own view how to roll it out. First of all, I can't understand why politicians are scared of implementing UBI. This should be treated as an opportunity, not as a threat. Italian government that is now in power, populist as it may be, one of its top flagships, if you like, policy is UBI. And I wish them well if they can pay for it, so they introduce it as quickly as possible, because then we will have one great example, hopefully. Do it quick and dirty. And that's what universal credit to some extent is. It's not quick, it's dirty, but it's there. So we should take an example how to roll out UBIA in general. And this is my main proposal. Don't give the government a say on UBI. Extract it out of the government. Do create a body like the Office of Budget Responsibility that will be controlled by the Parliament, that will be having a budget that is ring-fenced without automatic progressive increase, say 4, 5, or even 10% of the. There should be a kind of a goal. First of all, it will be able to be controlled by the universal credit, because the mechanism will be there. I'm thinking about the the conditional UBI. But we should make a goal that unconditional UBI, this is what people will get as a matter of right, by say 2030, reaches the current poverty line. So in 2030, that poverty line will be higher. So what it means is that people will be able, in 2030, to sustain themselves at the today's level. So they won't be having as much worth of services and goods in 2030, but they will have as much as it is available today. And by 2040, I suggest that the unconditional and conditional UBI should enable people to progressively reach the minimum wage. Why? Because that would create the pathway to a new style of living, that people will earn decent living, will really have the chance to do whatever they want, but with some restriction. They also have to contribute in whatever way they can to society. Anybody that would like to know more about that, you're welcome to go into the website or the book that talks about not only UBI, but artificial intelligence, democracy, and other areas. So, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Tony. On affordability, you said, hey, it's only 3%. Surely the chancellors throw around 3% in giveaways. But what's the answer to the question that was raised from the audience earlier, that there are many other things that politicians might want to spend that 3% on, given a choice between saving the NHS and the basic income? And all the other things, as I mentioned, we suffered from austerity, lots of local government cutbacks and so on. How would you argue that politicians would be brave enough to stop these other possible solutions and give this to basic income?
It's a question of priorities, of course, but if we think that we are getting half of the UBI at 5,000 level right now in tax allowance, this is worth £2,500 net. So the 3%, which is more or less what it would have cost to get it to 3%, to 5,000 for everyone, including children, would have, yes, would have some effect on the budget, because you wouldn't then finance NHS and so on. But as David mentioned in his introductory speech, it's the cycling effect of those £5,000 that everybody would get. That £5,000 would generate extra income and would pay perhaps more than 3% than the government injects. That's almost like an investment, if you think.
So I see various people want to raise a hand, but I'm aware time's moving on. What I'm going to suggest is we will come back to these questions at the session at the end. There's a couple more presentations I'd like to slip in quickly. Tony, you say your book's outside, available for
£10.
£10?
Instead of 13, yes.
Instead of 13, very good.
Yes.
And if you hand over to the microphone to the next speaker, and I'll ask the audience once again to thank you for your presentation.